Feng Jingxin was overjoyed. She secretly made a deal with her dad. Feng Tingshen did surprise Aunt Lin Wu as soon as they got home. She hung up, jumping and cheering. But in an instant, she thought of the person she'd been purposely ignoring. Mom, Rongsu. These days, she'd turned off her phone and stayed away just to avoid answering Rongsu's calls. She was sure her mom loved her more than anything and would never really ignore her. But when Longing hit her, she called her mom then froze. Once they were home, Rongsu would do everything to keep her away from Aunt Lin Wu. Overwhelmed by anger and frustration, she hung up abruptly. It was the middle of the night back home. Rongsu was fast asleep when her phone rang. Her heart skipped a bit when she saw it was her daughter. She reached for the phone only for the call to drop. Worried, she called back. No answer. She dialed the villa's landline. Aunt Lin simply said the girl must have pressed it by accident. No one knew Jingxin had refused to answer out of spite. That night, Rongsu couldn't fall asleep again. She'd already sent the divorce papers, giving up custody of Jingxin. But blood is thicker than anything. This worry had become her softest, most painful chain. As for the divorce agreement, Feng Tingshen had completely forgotten about it ever since he'd spoken to Lin Wu. He quietly flew back home with Jingxin. No one told Rongsu. Half a month had passed since she escaped that suffocating house. She'd finally grown used to peace, to living alone. One weekend morning, sunlight filled her small apartment. Her neighbor dropped by with snacks, thanking her for saving her little girl from a mad dog days earlier. She thought life would stay this quiet until a trending post about T University's EBITH anniversary popped up. Those familiar faces, her old glory, they tore through her calm like a knife. Once she was a genius, the brightest star in AI. If she hadn't married right after graduation, trapped in a family for 6 years, she would be standing among those honored alumni today. Her heart in chaos, she drove back to her old campus without thinking. Outside the familiar lab building, an old friend called her name. Chai Xun. 20 minutes later, in a tea house, he asked, "How have you been?" Rongsu smiled faintly. "I'm okay. I'm getting a divorce." Her words were light, but 6 years of bitterness lay hidden inside. Chai Shu looked at her sincerely. "The company is yours. Come back and lead us." Rongsu's fingers turned pale. She couldn't speak. She'd been away from the industry for far too long. The world of AI had rushed forward without her. Marriage had worn away her shine. Now, she barely even had the courage to pick up her dreams again. She had no idea that Feng Tingshen was already back. That in her daughter's eyes, she was the villain standing in the way of happiness. That the marriage she'd let go was about to crash back into her new life and drag her straight into hell. Feng Tingshen returned only to surprise another woman. He'd long forgotten the one who'd waited for him, who'd wasted her youth for him. When they meet again, her daughter's hatred, her ex-husband's coldness, her broken dreams, her destroyed dignity. Will Rongsu turn back this time?